I've been looking for ways to enhance teaching with technology for many years. I've always been interested in that aspect of education. And what I found with the eNotation pilot that we did, where we had selected 3 texts, one from Descartes, one from Newton, some excerpts from Newton's Principia, and some excerpts from the Leibniz-Clark correspondence about the debate between Newton and Leibniz concerning the nature of space and time. What I found was that the activity of annotating, which I found I learned a lot from when I did the Hume project, was also something that the students learned from. And not only that, but as an educator, it gave me insight into what students were doing as they were reading these texts that was tremendously valuable. So let me give you just one example. As one of the very first things you notice as you see students' eNotations, because I was able to see what they were writing even though they weren't able to see each other's eNotations, I was able to see their eNotations. One of the things you start noticing is just how a student can pick out a passage that they find particularly challenging, that he or she finds particularly challenging. And also, they'll make notes that really make it easier for me to understand what that challenge is. So as I look at the eNotations, I start saying, oh, this student finds this challenging, and that student finds that challenging. And wow, I wouldn't have thought that this passage was difficult, or I wouldn't have thought that there was this connection to this other issue, because this student wrote some note connecting it to some other thing. And so it was almost as if I could see my students thinking during the process of reading, which is something that I just don't have access to any other way. This technology allowed me to have access to a part of student learning that I haven't ever been a part of, because when they're off reading on their own, they're on their own. But when they're eNotating and I have access to their eNotations, it's almost like I can see them thinking. And with that information, with what they put in those eNotations, that can be something that can really help me shape my class, help me shape my lecture, help me know what to spend more time on, what to spend less time on. If I see, here's a bunch of students that on this entire section of the work, there's not a single annotation, I can just sort of touch base on that in class and double check that everybody's okay on that, and then devote my time to other sections where they really are struggling. Now, of course, with enough experience, you always have a sense of where students are getting hung up or not, just from your experience having taught the works. But with the eNotation system, you get a much more fine-grained insight into what this particular group of students that you have in front of you here today are finding interesting, or what they're finding challenging, what connections they're making. And there were some genuine surprises. So for example, I had a student who ordinarily would not participate in class at all. Her work was sort of standard, not really stellar or anything like that, and on regular assessments such as essays or tests or whatever, but her eNotations were fantastic. And so this is the kind of thing that as an educator always makes you sort of go, oh, what's going on here? Why is there a student who has challenges in the ordinary setting, but when you give her this other tool, suddenly she has a kind of freedom to explore her own thoughts, explore connections she wouldn't have explored, and write these great annotations. And so it started me to think about just how we are assessing our students to gauge their learning, and how a tool like the annotation tool can really be one of a whole suite of tools that can help us assess learning, so that we have more and more ways of understanding where our students are facing challenges. I think one of their main reactions when I talked to them about the eNotation experience was that first of all, it kept all their notes in one place. So there was some kind of pragmatic value to it, because they could go back and see all their notes very clearly. They could read it, they joke, oh, I could actually read it because I typed it. It wasn't like when I scribbled it in the margin and I couldn't read it, or I ran out of room. So there's some pragmatic virtues. But beyond that, I think what they all reported was that it sort of forced them to read more closely, more attentively. And that was what they reported to me. They said, oh, I found myself, I was sort of surprised myself that I was suddenly taking a lot more time with my reading, and I was paying a lot more attention. I was reading more closely than if I had just had it in print. And you know, as a teacher of philosophy, when we're reading these sort of challenging works, it's wonderful to hear that students are finding a tool useful to keep them focused and engaged. Because these kinds of texts are not the kinds of texts that you read once and you know everything that's going on. These are texts that require close study, close examination, rereading multiple times before we can begin to get a good, clear sense of what's going on. And that seemed to be facilitated or enhanced by this tool. This tool seemed to really make students read more frequently, and read better, read with more depth and engagement. And that's what they reported to me. So overall, I think it was a really valuable experience, not just for me as an educator, but also for my students. They learned more from those readings than they would have if they had not used the annotation system. I think the most noticeable thing is, again, the level of engagement. I don't know quite how else to describe it, but you know, if you teach long enough, you always know whether you've got a class of students where only 10% of them are doing the readings before class, or if you've got 50% or 100%, because of the questions that they ask and the contributions that they make in the discussions. So what I noticed with the pilot that we did with the eNotation was that my students were coming to class ready to make more valuable contributions. Their contributions were just better in class. Our discussions were better. We had more discussions. And it was precisely because they had already engaged the text in a deeper and more meaningful way. And so there were fewer of the sorts of questions or discussions where there was a lot of explaining on my part, and there were more discussions that were driven by their own insights into the text. And so it if you want to put it this way, it sort of raised the level of the discussion. You know, sometimes we say that about a particularly bright student who comes in, and you can always has that question that really raises the level of the discussion. Well, I had more of that because the students seemed to be much more engaged with the text.
Student advantages. Students learn by eNotating, read more, read better, and more attentively, gain organizational and review tools, stay focused and engaged with more depth. Educator advantages. Insight into how individual students read the text, access to student thought processes, ability to identify challenging passages to shape lectures, fine-grained insight that helps improve teaching, improved understanding of individual student capabilities. Students are prepared to make valuable in-class contributions.